Has any political movement been so thoroughly discredited as MAGA has over the past 6 months? Ukraine, Iran, Israel first, an expanded Pentagon budget topping $1 trillion, gaslighting about how the Epstein list first existed, then it was on Pam Bondi's desk, then it didn't exist, and now it was ginned up by the Democrats like Obama and Biden. Trump has completely abandoned his entire populist sales pitch for his reelection point by point. Here's him talking about the real motivation for his presidency at a White House prayer luncheon for members of the White House Faith Office after meeting with the deputy commander of NATO earlier today. This is your political moment of zen while people are still filtering into the live.
And the alternative is one of two things. You can either get all these things and make the economy strong, or you're going to literally have perhaps a depression where you people so rich, so beautiful, so nice to look at will be totally busted. And let's see how long your wife stays with you. You're beautiful. She'll stay with you for about 3 weeks and she'll say, darling, I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore, darling. I'm leaving you. I said to one guy, he's a very, very unattractive man, but he's smart and he's rich. And I said, you better hope we get this thing passed because your wife will be gone within about 2 minutes. He said, you're right.
Oh, hilarious. The good old White House prayer meetings where marriage is not consecrated via vows before God, but how much money you have. I think that's the entire administration in a nutshell, and the Biden administration, and the previous Trump administration, and the Obama administration. I mean, I could go back every administration, and, at least they are honest about it. All right, y'all? So, hello and welcome to State of Play on MintPress News. I'm your host, Greg Stoker, and how many years have we been saying it now? The Russia-Ukraine war is bound to continue, potentially years from now, ending in a frozen conflict with a vast demilitarized zone spanning from the Black Sea to what? Kharkiv, Belarus? None can tell. No crystal balls here. But Trump's position on the war, including his campaign assertion that he would end the war before he even came into office, has taken a complete reversal over the past week. And the U.S. Congress, in a show of bipartisan support to keep the war going, is in lockstep behind the president, who says that Russia has 50 days to come to the table or else. What they'll probably get is Taco Trump. Trump always chickens out, but we'll see. We're playing it We're playing it by ear, day to day, as the news cycle it continues to get insane. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about AI, the Gulf states. We're going to be bringing Lebanon into this picture because it's part of the picture. Secondary tariffs, bunch of insanity about the war in Ukraine. So we are here at Mint Press News, a small independent newsroom with no corporate sponsors. We have been demonetized, I think, since forever on YouTube. Yeah, I think especially since the Syrian war kicked off. But if you're picking up the Civil War, but if you're picking up what we're putting down, we're on Patreon. If you want to sling us $5-10 a month, I forget what it is. It really helps us keep going, and we appreciate your contribution to Watchdog journalism. And if you can't do it, because life is becoming more and more unlivable here in America, in the West in general, as the material conditions continue to degrade, you can just share, subscribe, spread the word. We're just glad you are here and helping us with engagement. Hope you guys enjoy. So, anyways, I just want to say that I know the Ukraine war is not high up on some of y'all's geopolitical interests, and so we're going to play some B-roll right now so you guys can have something fun to look at in case you're watching the audio. But it's important as our world grows even more interconnected. What's happening here is connected to, for instance, the impending war. Sorry, I had to make the screen smaller. In Lebanon. Yes, Lebanon remains a colony of the Western financial and political elite. What some may call the capitalist class, though through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and is receiving immense pressure to disarm Hezbollah. More on that later. Suffice to say that The U.S. playbook is played out, but the powers that be will try to exert economic and military force against any that oppose them. In this instance, it's the Russian government. So what are we going to do? Threaten sanction, threaten more weapons to one of our allies? Honestly, U.S. foreign policy at this point is like, because it's so detached from reality and it's just getting older and it's receding and our power is diminishing. It's like a 40-year-old man. U.S. foreign policy is really much like a 40-year-old man who absolutely refuses to recognize and acknowledge that he has a receding hairline. Like that's U.S. foreign policy at this point, in my estimation. So Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal, everyone knows who Lindsey Graham is. I'm sure over the next coming weeks, everyone's going to know who Richard Blumenthal is. He is the super neocon Democratic hawk that's always like getting on Face the Nation with Lindsey Graham. They're urging quick action by the U.S. as Russia, quote, escalates the offensive in Ukraine, this is, I think, CNN reporting, including the passage of a bipartisan bill they've introduced implementing sanctions on Moscow. They introduced the bill last Wednesday. That said, they could be the sledgehammer President Donald Trump needs to end the conflict. Again, the sledgehammer of sanctions, because Russia hasn't been sanctioned before. The legislation, which would allow the president to levy a 500% tariff on imports from countries that purchase Russian uranium, gas, and oil, has gained momentum in the Senate as Trump has signaled, not signed, he hasn't signed anything, signaled that he will escalate U.S. actions against Russia. And of course, we could play NATO clips from the Oval Office today, but it's nothing new. Blumenthal, this is Lindsey Graham speaking, Blumenthal and I have got 85 co-sponsors, again, bipartisan co-sponsors, in the United States Senate for congressional sanctions with a sledgehammer available to President Trump to go after Putin's economy and all those countries who prop up the Putin war machine. This is where we get into secondary sanctions. Insanity. Graham said on CBS Face the Nation on Sunday, being yesterday, referring to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, of course, Trump told reporters yesterday that we will see tomorrow, and tomorrow's come and gone. Well, it's the evening, but the workday is over in Washington, D.C. for most people. When asked whether he would announce sanctions against Russia, noting he'll meet on Monday with NATO Secretary General Secretary General Mark Rutte, and pledged to send very sophisticated military. That was a quote, very sophisticated military to Ukraine. Graham and Blumenthal, of course, the two co-sponsors of this bill in the Senate, recently returned from Rome, where they attended a conference with Zelensky, focusing on recovery of Ukraine, and met with, other European leaders. And Blumenthal said the European allies expressed to lawmakers that any potential U.S. sanctions would have to be tough, rigorous to change behavior. That's the whole point of U.S. sanctions. If you guys aren't checking, it's either to change behavior, or if behavior within a quote unquote regime cannot be changed, it's in order to degrade the material conditions so much that there's a popular uprising that could be exploited by Western intelligence services in order to implement a new regime friendly to Western interests. That's what they're trying to do in Iran. And if they can't do regime change, they go for regime collapse. They've been trying to stoke a uprising within the elites, within the Kremlin. It says my audio has been muted, but I guess it hasn't been. Was to stoke a popular or an elite uprising and an overthrow in the Kremlin by targeting Russian oligarchs' assets, stealing their yachts, basically freezing assets all over Europe and SWIFT banking system, et cetera, in order to cause a palace coup. That's what they've wanted with Russia since it started. If you're reading The Economist and the Atlantic Council in February, 2022 or whatever, this is what they were promising. Palace coup. It's happening. There's going to be an elite uprising in the Kremlin. So this is nothing new. It's to change behavior, or if you can't change behavior, regime change. So this is the same messaging, of course, that you got from the Biden administration. In fact, this may actually be an escalation, with Axios News reporting this morning that two White House sources told them that the plan would include long-range missiles, not just sanctions, but long-range missiles that could strike deep inside Russia, a definitive escalation and a seismic policy shift for the Trump administration, who claimed boldly that, the war in Ukraine would be over before Trump even got into office. So, of course, that was never bound to happen. Here's the one thing to pay attention to here is that we've been saying all along about the Trump presidency. It's not anti-war. It cannot afford to be. At this late stage in the American imperial project, whether Democrat, Republican, unipolarity can only, in terms of a global power hegemon, can only be maintained through force at this point. We don't have any soft power left, after the genocide in Palestine and the hypocrisy around the world. Also, the fact that we got rid of USAID, which was one of our distributors of quote unquote aid and soft power throughout the global South, no longer there. We've even defunded Radio Free Africa and Radio Free Europe and all that stuff. At this late stage, again, in the Imperial Project, it's force, either military or economic, sometimes both in tandem, like in Ukraine and Israel. We're seeing that on the regional scale with regards to Iran, and with a more global rival like Russia, that's what they'll do. Inevitably, it will not work. Everybody who's watching this show is savvy enough to know that. But until then, we are doomed to a period of increasing self-destructive violence and ideologically driven escalation. Or is it all talk and the latest manifestation of Taco Trump? Trump always chickens out. Let's check in with Fox News from yesterday to break down the neocon talking points. They haven't really been updated because no significant announcements were made after the meeting with General Rutte from NATO in the Oval Office. But let's just check in with the neocon talking points because they're shared by both neocon Dems and neocon conservatives. And then we might look at some Atlantic Council policy position papers if you guys are feeling really lucky and you want to get into that. So let me pull this up right now. Wait, where did it go? Wait, we got that one. Hang on. Oh, for some reason it's already playing. Sorry, guys. I don't know what the hell's going on today with the stuff. Sorry.
We're not happy with Putin. I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much.
So this clip specifically was taken from last Tuesday.
Right now, because he's killing a lot of people. And a lot of them are his soldiers and their soldiers, mostly. And it's now up to 7,000 a week.
President Trump expressing his frustrations with Russian President Vladimir Putin this week. Mr. Trump reportedly is thinking about giving Ukraine more aid for the first time since he took office back in January. It comes as Russia has ramped up deadly drone attacks in recent days. For more on this, let's bring in Dr. Rebecca Grant, senior fellow at the Lexington Institute. It does sound, Dr. Grant, like the president is extremely upset with Vladimir Putin.
All right, real quick. Every time you hear where someone's from, you've got to make sure you look it up. Lexington Institute. So it's a Beltway policy think tank. The Lexington Institute is actually just a MAGA pro-war hawk think tank. They write articles like Trump lit a fire under NATO, but more needs to be done to contain the Russia-China access. B-21 Raider. The Iran war proves we need more stealth bombers from National Security Journal. So this is kind of what you're getting. More bombers, more weapons to Ukraine. She's a senior fellow there, so let's go.
Yes, he is. President Trump hoped to be at a ceasefire in Ukraine by now, but instead we see Putin lashing out with these horrible massed drone and missile attacks. So what I see, John, is I think that President Trump, he's fixed NATO, he's got that going well, and now Trump is...
Do you hear that, guys? Trump has fixed NATO because I guess NATO countries have promised, and this is not enforceable really, have promised to make their defense budget 5% of their GDP by 2030. Good luck. Or 2035. No, it's 2035. 10 years. Good luck. They're already having a massive material crisis. But yeah, I guess we're stripping social welfare programs across the global north in order to pay for stuff like ICE and increase military spending, not just in the United States, but in Europe as
Is
well.
ready to play hardball with Russia. And Trump has a lot of options. And if I were Putin, I would watch out.
Well,
What new options? There's literally no new option. What, you're going to send them the same shit you've been sending them for 2 years, for like the past few years? You're going to sanction them more? This is where we get to secondary sanctions because it's the dumbest idea. But yeah, what is this lady saying? What more are they going to do aside from putting U.S. boots on the ground? And if we're not going to put them on the ground in Iran or like southern Lebanon, there's to fight Hezbollah. There's no way in hell we're sending people to Ukraine.
what are some of those options? I mean, we could put more sanctions on their oil production, but that brings its own set of problems, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And so I think the number one requirement here is air defense. Without a strong air defense over Ukraine, the negotiating position collapses. So I think that when President Trump talks about this next week, we will hear more about providing air defenses, probably both through the U.S. and through NATO partners.
I love this conversation about air defenses because we don't even have it enough for like our own bases in the Middle East, not to mention Israel. Like oh my God. Yeah. I mean, look, guys, this is the Lexington Institute. It's all propaganda made to gin up consent for war. Then we're going to look at the Atlantic Council. It's all propaganda. This is why we actually don't call it the military industrial complex. We call it the military industrial media academic complex. So the media is like CNN, Fox News that gins up consent for war. But the academic aspect is not just college campuses written by like hawk professors in academia, but it's also think tanks. Think tanks are an integral part of the military industrial complex. So yes, more weapons to Ukraine. Make your corporate masters even richer.
On the sanctions, that bill that Lindsey Graham talks about is ready to go. It's a 500% tariff on some of Russia's biggest customers, and it is moving its way along. So Trump has quite a lot up his sleeve at this point to deal with a recalcitrant and Putin who just has a taste for war.
Yeah, Putin has a taste for war, but, you know, we're doing a genocide and bombing Iran. And, you know, we're the only country that's bombed as many countries as we have. But yes, it's totally not our hawkishness either. We can blame it all on Putin. I'm not saying you have to be a fan of Putin. I'm not. But this is so propagandized and detached from reality. It's insane. And then we're going to talk about why this is completely driven by ideology and is not not based out of anything factual. Obviously, it's not. But let's just play this out because there's a lot of points I want to make that she's bringing up. She believes that the key to winning this war or getting closer to a negotiated settlement is by winning the air war with more defense, like with more missiles, with more air defense artillery. They just launched almost 800 drones this weekend, Russia, or last week. You know, we don't have the air defenses to deal with that. So, but okay, lady Rebecca Grant, Dr. Rebecca Grant from the Lexington Institute. Let's see what else you're cooking.
The Ukrainians have just done an incredible job in fighting off the attacks of this much bigger and better funded ally. I think of the attacks on those bombers.
We're gonna look at a live map later on, and we can see how, you know, they're losing quite a bit of ground.
There's the drone attacks on the Russian bombers that were more than 1,000 miles away from the Ukrainian border a few weeks ago. But is there more that the president could or should do? I'm talking about President Trump now. Could or should do to help the Ukrainians out?
See, if you look at the questioning, and I just wanted to harp on this for a second because it's very telling about how all this works. He said these are like pre-planned. They have pre-interviews. Like, very rarely do I go on a platform where I have to do pre-interviews because I'm usually not on big ones like Fox or CNN or NBC. I mean, for Al Jazeera or Democracy Now, you'll do like pre-interviews. But all of this was covered in the pre-interview. He's like, what kind of questions are you going to ask? How? Well, it wasn't him. It was his producer. And they kind of orchestrated it, the tempo of the conversation. And now they're the part where she's like, this is what Trump should do. It's going to be more hawkish than what he's already said he was going to do Monday, that being today.
Well, there is always more. I think the tactical situation is Ukraine is holding Russia pretty well on the ground. The real pressure
Nope.
is these
Nope.
massed drone attacks, which are so much bigger than anything that we've seen. They're going against civilian targets. It's typically a bunch of Iranian-made drones, some decoys.
Okay, yep. Roping in Iran. You know, this is why they're starting to call. So this new form of messaging that's starting to coalesce right now is they're building another axis. You know the axis from World War II, and then George Bush brought up the axis of evil, like Saddam, North Korea, the Taliban, Al Qaeda, brought in Libya. You know, at the Obama brought in Libya. So now they're talking, and this is interesting. They're talking about a Russia, China, Iran, and North Korean axis now. So it's the same old regurgitated global war on terror propaganda, but they're really pushing this. And if you've been, and I follow Chatham House, the Atlantic Council, Brookings Institute, they have been putting out an absolute think tank policy blitz right now, and this is all part of it.
And then 10 or 20 really difficult, either hypersonic or cruise or ballistic missiles scattered in there. And that is directly to pressure the NATO allies who are providing air defenses. So I'd really like to see President Trump greenlight another drawdown to provide Patriot missiles, more of the Norwegian U.S. NASAMS. They've got a 94% success rate. And hey, you know, the European partners and others are doing really well. Australia has sent its wedge-tail plane there to help track aerial threats.
Oh my God, guys, they sent the wedge-tail plane. This is really going to turn stuff around. All right, now we've gone through the talking points. Now let's actually talk about what's going on here. So an issue here is that the Western hawks refuse to incorporate into their plans, at least superficially, or in terms of like analysis, is that Russia views the war in Ukraine and NATO expansionism as an existential threat, a threat to their existence. And you might not like it or understand the Russian position, but the reality here is that there's nothing we can really do to change it. We are locked in this forever war, you know, rhetoric pushed by the military industrial think tanks, that all Ukraine needs is a silver bullet, wedge tails from Australia, right? One more weapon systems to win the Ukraine air war, one more round of sanctions, now secondary sanctions of countries that trade with Russia, and it will break the Russian economy, and they will be forced through economic reasons to abandon the war and adopt a softer negotiating position. So what is the definition of insanity again? The Russian position was laid out in June of last year. Russia demands for ending the war in Ukraine include territorial concessions, Ukrainian neutrality, and restrictions on its military capabilities. You know, specifically, Russia demands the ceding of Ukrainian territory, including regions that are technically not fully under its control, and Kiev's agreement not to pursue NATO membership. Whether you think those terms are crazy or not, they're not going to budge on them, most likely. You know, and they also see limitations on Ukraine armed forces and weapons system, effectively aiming to demilitarize and neutralize Ukraine. And why would they, within the context of great power politics, where there are no good guys, back down from that position? What Ukraine really needs is more manpower. Right. I mean, they need a lot of other things, but like that's one of their weakest points right now. They're having to recruit. And this has been happening since last year, like 40-year-old, 50-year-old men into like line infantry units because all the young men are dead or have fled the country. So they didn't get drafted in the war. This reminds me of like that. What was the war in Paraguay where they lost an entire generation? I'm mind blanking on it right now, but this is kind of like what we'd like an existential generational doom that has befallen them. So we can't give them more men, more air defense and artillery munitions, which we don't have. And so all we can do is go back to the Trump playbook of threatening now secondary sanctions, and we can get some B-roll going, which are penalties imposed by one country, the sanctioning country, on individuals or entities in other countries, third parties, who engage in transactions with a country or entity already under primary sanctions. So if India trades with Russia, he's proposing sanctioning India. And we're going to talk about why that's stupid. Essentially, they target those who help sanctioned entities evade or undermine primary sanctions, secondary sanctions. This is really stupid because Russia's biggest trading partners are China, the Netherlands, Germany, Turkey, and Belarus. No one really cares about Belarus, but the other countries are big deal, according to world's top exports. China is the largest, followed by the Netherlands, and then Germany. Turkey and Belarus are also significant partners, and India has had strategic relationships with Russia since the Cold War. And don't really want to spend a lot of time dwelling on this, but it's indicative that the Trump and his foreign policy team doesn't know what it's doing. We've already proven unwilling to sanction China as much as he threatened due to many reasons, including the shock to global markets, which the U.S. relies on for the health of its own economy. One of the reasons the 12-day war with Iran, for instance, was negotiated was because the Iranians were threatening to mine the Strait of Hormuz and shock the oil market. Of course, there's other reasons. Israel was getting hammered. They're running out of their strategic deterrence, which is their integrated air defense artillery system. But that was one consideration. So sanction Germany, the bedrock of NATO's future industrial base, now that EU countries have agreed to ramp up defense spending to 5% GDP by 2035. Like what? Sanction the Netherlands, a crucial diplomatic ally. Turkey, hugely important for the U.S. plan for a, quote, new Middle East. Sanction India for buying Russian products, potentially alienating one of our greatest regional allies against China. The bottom line is Russia has cultivated strong trade ties with countries like China, India, Turkey, and Brazil, who are not participating in Western sanctions. And we knew this was going to happen. Let's look at Marco Rubio talking about why sanctions don't really matter. And Marco Rubio being our Secretary of State. And I think this was from last year. Wait, I'm not really sure. I'm going to have to fact check this. But yes, this is him talking specifically about why sanctions aren't going to work and why this is absolutely stupid. And Marco Rubio is not a dumb guy. He's actually really smart. He's just a sociopath who will do anything for access to political power. So even our Secretary of State knows this isn't going to work, but we're going to do it anyways, because why not? Hang on, wait. There we go.
Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China.
Okay, so that must have been from last month or in May.
Western Hemisphere south of us cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
That was a funny part at the end. But that's right, guys. They know it. Like, everybody knows it. But this is all, again, propaganda for the war. And, some people just can't come to terms, again, like a 40-year-old man with a receding hairline, that things ain't like they used to be back in the 90s, bro. Like, you can start taking hair pills, like, come to terms with it, start getting new haircuts, or you can just keep denying that you have a receding hairline and keep doubling down on things that don't work. So, yeah, the bottom line is Russia has cultivated these strong trade ties with countries like China, India, Turkey, Brazil, who are not participating in Western sanctions. We did an episode, I guess, at least on my own platform, Colonial Outcast, last week, talking about how India is really the weak link in the BRICS because it's full of like its own contradictions. And while it will trade in local currencies, it's never going to de-dollarize, but that's beyond like the scope, at least as things stand now with the Modi government. But that's beyond the scope of this conversation. So Russia utilizes established international procurement networks, kind of like Iran does, to evade sanctions, and a shadow fleet of tankers to circumvent oil price caps and sanctions on its energy exports. It utilizes basically like complex supply chains and has developed sophisticated methods to move goods and money through convoluted networks, again, to avoid sanctions. And the problem is that something these hawk think tank people will never tell the American public when they get onto Fox News or CNN to push their propaganda is that the Russian economy, while taking hits, has proven to be incredibly resilient in a way that, the Iranian economy does. And of course, both Russia and Iran want sanctions relief and a better relationship with the United States, but they're not going to do it in the face of like existential threats to their sovereignty. And even though, like Iran, it's taken hits again, adjusting to sanctions by finding new partners and routes for trade, like with Brazil, has been helpful. And also Russia has transitioned to a full war economy, relying on domestic production and imports from countries not participating in sanctions. Remember when the U.S. used to have domestic production? Those were the times. Besides, there's an absurd amount of enforcement challenges, secondary sanctions. Some countries lack the resources or political will to enforce secondary sanctions effectively, and there can be inconsistencies in enforcement efforts. Broad secondary sanctions can harm economies of allied countries, create instability, leading to reluctance to fully implement them anyways. And without global coordination in implementing and enforcing sanctions, there will be plenty of loopholes for evasions. So, of course, Trump's not going to do the 500% tariffs on Russia and our allies who are also trading with Russia for their energy security. It's just not going to do it. And even if they were, there's no way to enforce them. This is all stupid and it won't work, but it's not necessarily supposed to for some people on the political spectrum. If Trump is able to get NATO countries to pay, well, that's a big win for the Mick. But in terms of defeating Russia on the battlefield and reestablishing NATO deterrence, well, that ship has really sunk to the bottom of the Black Sea. If anything, putting aside the monstrous casualties sustained in the war, which Russia can, whether better, that's just about anybody. Sorry, that was kind of syntactically confusing. Putting aside the monstrous casualties sustained in the war, which Russia can weather, it's a Monday, weather better than just about any other country in the world. It has also transformed and professionalized its military over the past 3 years, right? If you recall, during the initial invasion of Ukraine, the Russian army was a bit of a mess. They had stalled armored divisions pushing south from Belarus that literally ran out of gas due to terrible logistical planning. They had no experienced officer corps and virtually no non-commissioned officer corps, which is why Ukrainian snipers were Xing out generals left and right during the opening days of the war. These things aren't issues anymore. We could speak for hours about how this engineered war in Ukraine had the worst possible blowback from the American perspective, but I don't want to belabor the point. One of the stupid things that happened from our perspective is that we forced the Russians to become a more professional military, and they have. So let's just look at the battlefield via open source, live updated map from the Institute of the Study of War. All right, stand by, guys. Pulling it up right here. My God, is it having trouble loading? That's annoying. All right. Share screen. Coming up. Coming up. So this is where it stands right now. So this is, again, assess control of the terrain in Ukraine as of July 13th, 2025. This is updated every 24 hours. And the Institute for the Study of War and Critical Threats, not my favorite stuff, but it's some of the better open source stuff we can get right now. So zooming out, if my computer actually has enough memory to load anything, this is really annoying. But this is where things stand right now. Crimea and Donetsk, where pre-war Russian de facto territories. And now we have the disintegration of the reservoir here. And if you look at these, the dotted lines here along in front of the solid line, those are Russian assessed Russian control advances. Now, if you zoom in over the past 24 hours, you've got, see this solid red color here. And if you go along the line, you're going to see more and more of these. These are territorial gains within the past 24 hours. And if you look at this map daily, you'll see that it is a slow grinding advance along the front. And there's basically no way to stop that from happening. Russia doesn't have the same manpower shortages. They have a bigger industrial base. We don't even have enough 155 artillery shells and Patriot battery air defense artillery for our own deterrents. We saw Jake Sullivan say that we stopped aid to Ukraine because we couldn't go into our own stockpiles. So, it's a grind. It's what we call a grinding advance, and there's absolutely nothing we can do to stop it. And what I mean by we is West, NATO, and instead of pushing for, I guess the thought was that when Trump came into office, he had this like massive pull with President Putin, just based off force of personality. Turns out that, Putin got to where he is because he's a certain type of person who really doesn't give a damn about any of that. And he's going to work in his own best interest. And that is to just keep a grinding advance going because they can keep feeding men into the machine. And if the West isn't going to make any concessions, then they'll just keep the war going, gain more territory and more diplomatic concessions. Yeah, so there's not a lot of political pressure right now on the Ukrainians from the Trump administration to come to some sort of adversarial negotiation. All right. So that's where things stand. It doesn't really matter what your feelings about Trump or Putin or Zelensky are. That is the reality on the ground. Okay. So now let's talk about the complete detachment from reality that we're going to start seeing over the next few months as people try to do a 180 about all these Trump policy positions, from the Epstein files, no longer existing to being ginned up by Barack Obama to think tanks and like intelligence cutouts like the Atlantic Council, who are completely misreading, intentionally so, what has happened over the past couple months. So this one is an interesting case study. This is by Frederick Kemp. He is the chair of the Atlantic Council. This was from 3 days ago. And it is inherently problematic because it reads, turning on Putin would fit Trump's trend of second term wins, baby. Yeah, getting back into the Ukraine-Russia war is going to be a win. It may seem counterintuitive. That's how it opens up, because it friggin' is. After years of speculation over U.S. President Donald Trump's sympathies for Russian president, the logic of Trump 2.0 suggests that a tightening of U.S. screws on Russia would make perfect sense. In his second term, Trump has defied his critics with several major international wins, and he's relished the results. His green light for the June 22nd U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear-related targets was a stunning interpretation of what defines America first. All right, so within the framework of the Atlantic Council CEO, he's calling bombing Iran a stunning interpretation of American first. Cool. At the NATO summit in The Hague, ironic, days later, he pivoted from years of lambasting European partners to securing a historic agreement to lift defense and defense-related spending to 5% of gross domestic product, while reaffirming shared security guarantees. Remember how he platformed on being anti-NATO and how we need to get out of NATO? Turns out he's fine staying within NATO as long as they pay more. Yeah, just complete heightened militarization across the North American and European continents. But both Iran and NATO moves are legacy-defining, peace through strength actions. I'm wondering exactly what Trump has done in his presidency yet to promote peace through strength, where you're looking more and more increasingly like a paper tiger. I guess we're going to start sending more stuff to Ukraine to accomplish what? The next link in this potential chain of positive disruption should be Russia. There are signs Trump is steering in that direction. It wasn't too long ago that Trump praised Putin's peacemaking intentions, his smarts, and his strength. And then, of course, he disavowed all that. I mean, I'm not going to go and read the whole article. A very little risk. It concludes, turning the screws on Putin would provide Trump further wins at low cost. Low cost for who? We're going to be sending almost like $500 billion to this conflict before this thing gets checked. He can silence those who continue to argue that some tawdry relationship with Russia explains his reluctance to punish Putin. He would further assert U.S. global primacy. What? Adding the reassertion of deterrence in Europe to that in the Middle East. And if bringing peace is motivating Trump, he's only going to get there providing Ukraine more leverage for any coming negotiations. Pulling that off will take staying power and consistency that will make his second term accomplishments so far look like a warm-up act. There's plenty of reasons for skepticism, however. Those who doubt Trump has it in him haven't been paying attention to Iran or NATO. So one of the reasons think tanks exist, and one of the overriding philosophies behind them, is that all these politicians cannot And all these policy and decision makers and military commanders cannot afford to be subject matter experts on every regional conflict or every part of the world. That's why they write these policy papers and they're given gravitas and funding. And, people think because they're a think tank, that means they're smart, but they're pushing policy agendas. And this article from the head of the Atlantic Council was aimed directly at Trump and his officials within the Trump administration. If you remember from early on in his first term in 2016, he would not read intel briefs. All right, the CIA and the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, creates a morning briefing for the president with intelligence developments from around the world that president is supposed to be briefed on every day. And sometimes it's spoken word, sometimes it's read. But there was an expose that came out, I think it was in the New York Times, that the only way that they could get him to listen to the intel brief or read the damn thing was to insert his name in a flattering way every 2 goddamn sentences. And this is what this Atlantic Council policy paper reads like. There's actually no policy advice at all. It's just keep funding the war because, like, there's no strategy behind it. There's nothing. It's just, this was just a puff piece to flatter Trump. And, he's notorious. Well, insiders are talking about, like, the last person who gets his ear is what he's going to act off of. Right. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Yeah. Someone says, hey, Greg, not everybody reads. Yeah. So anyways, that's kind of what we're looking at. This was a puff piece, and there's a lot of people pushing him to war. And, people thought he would be able to resist that. I saw somewhere up in the comments that, like, Scott Ritter and other people were bloviating about how Trump was going to bring about peace. The reason they say things like that, and they have been right and gained a lot of credibility over discussing the war in Ukraine and how it was a lost cause. And yes, we all agree on that. For potentially for different purposes. The reason they thought that Trump was going to be an anti-war candidate and turn this whole thing around is because they don't understand our economic and political system. They don't. It's a bipartisan issue. I'm just going to leave it at that. There's a reason every U.S. president is an imperialist. Every U.S. president expands the funding for the war state, and they expand the funding for the police state, which are the same state. It's all about hegemonic control. And as our diplomatic and soft power and economic power recede over the globe, all the masks are coming off, all the furniture on stage is being taken away, and all you'll have is the iron wall behind the curtain of force. That's it. That's what. He doesn't have control over it. He's part of the system. If he wants to maintain his own access to political power and viability within the constructs of the donor class and the professional managerial class and the oligarchic billionaires who require chaos around the world, he's got to play ball. And of course, he's going to play ball. He's one of them. Like, people thought he was a populist. He's a billionaire. He's a real estate mogul. It's not even a real job. So, yeah. Yeah, someone says it's because they don't have a Marxist-Leninist understanding of empire. I mean, that's true. There are other ways to come to this same conclusion, but that's one hell of a way to do it. So, yeah, they basically, they don't have a critique or any sort of material analysis of what capitalism entails, which is imperialism, which ends in colonialism, the highest stage. So, yeah, that's what we're looking at. And I don't know why people are so, like, shocked. But the thing is, again, sorry, I thought I froze for a second. The thing is, again, this is Biden's policy. If Obama was in office, this would be Obama's policy. This would have been Trump's policy if Putin had invaded during Trump's presidency. Nothing's going to change. We're just going to keep funding the forever wars because, again, guys, and I know everybody knows this, the objective of American wars, especially like in the post-World War II era, we could probably argue after like Korea with some like limited contingency operations like in Somalia or like the Balkans during Clinton's presidency or like Panama, or overthrowing Noriega, like limited operations, but like wars they're not meant to achieve necessarily our stated strategic goals. The U.S. isn't meant to like win them. It wins when they last for as long as possible and wash as much money out of the public sector and into the private. So in this instance, Ukraine is going great. And let's talk about future investments in Ukraine within the context of, the US empire. Here's a great one, also from the Atlantic Council. This was from yesterday. Ukraine can benefit from growing tech ties between the Gulf states and the US. Now, before we get into this one, remember, Ukraine is, among other things, a capitalist project. Of course, reconstruction is going to be very magnanimously taken care of by BlackRock. And then most of Ukraine is going to end up being indebted to foreign landlords. But this is also an open air weapons test, not just for military readiness in a future conflict between the United States and China over the Strait of Taiwan. That's at least where they're thinking the flashpoint's going to happen. But it's also the military industrial complex wants to get in there and get all these sweet research grants for like better AI targeting programs, anti-drone warfare, stuff like this. So Ukraine has always been an open air weapons test for the Pentagon and associated defense contractors. So the recent conflict between Israel and Iran has shaken the Middle East security assumptions, obviously, and set the stage for new strategic alignments across the region. Amid escalating threats and shifting power dynamics, the United States and Gulf nations, Comprador Gulf nations, have moved swiftly to fortify a different kind of alliance, one anchored not in oil prices or arms sales, but in cooperation to develop and implement cutting-edge technologies. And one of the big concerns recently has been Saudi Arabia going over to more of a BRICS, like East allied policy stance, and to come away from like a failing Western imperium. Like they're basically playing both sides of the fence like they always do. But one of the ways that the Trump administration and the tech sector in general sought to bring Saudi back into the fold, because like we weren't going to give them like nuclear weapons or anything, but we wanted to sweeten the deal by investing in AI infrastructure to rival China and their digital Silk Road through Iran and stuff. So it's too late in the game to do that. It's kind of like there's too late in the game for the IMET corridor to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, but they're going to try. And Ukraine is going to be a big part of that, because Ukraine is where a lot of this AI is tested. So this emerging U.S. Gulf tech partnership really is not only a response to regional instability, but it's also a platform for global influence, right? They're trying to make it a platform for global influence. For Ukraine, it basically presents a strategically exciting opportunity to deepen engagement with both Washington and Gulf nations, while also advancing the country's own recovery and integration into established international innovation networks. And behind all of this, what they're trying to do, as I said, they're bringing up the rhetoric about this whole axis of evil, not just the axis of resistance with Iran, but axis of anti-West sentiment from like Russia, the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis. So they're definitely like, if you read between the lines of all these position papers, like all of these hawk tanks definitely envision what's happening right now to be like the prelude or the opening phases of a third world war, where you have the Russia, China, Iran axis with, the U.S., Comprador Gulf states, push for a new Abraham Accords in the Middle East that figures into the play, basically cultivating as many allies as possible in order to isolate the axis. And that's kind of like what we're looking at if you're reading between the lines. So cool. Someone just said, can we just rename the Holy Land Palantir Failed Hell? Oh man, we didn't even get into Lebanon. I'm sorry, guys. Like, it's all there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. I did want to spend time on the Russia-Ukraine thing, because it's seen as a pivotal flashpoint for this East-West war. Like that's kind of what we're saying. And of course, U.S. impunity, sanctions, the push to isolate Russia and China and Iran separately from each other. After Gaddafi got, well, we all know how he ended in Libya after trying to de-dollarize. and the ongoing genocide in Palestine, and the isolation of Lebanon, and the leveraging of the IMF and World Bank to control the Lebanese government as a form of neocolonialism in order to normalize with Israel and defang Hezbollah, has kind of made everybody go like, maybe de-dollarization is the play. Maybe we should form an axis against Western hegemony and unipolarity. And of course, this is not going to manifest overnight. But again, we are the receding hairline of empire. So, it's not really going to work out for them. But and we didn't have enough time to go into this. But they're trying to form this like multilateral alliance between all these Western interests to combat, not just BRICS, but specifically, of course, because BRICS is like full of its own contradictions. As I alluded to earlier, just look at India's position in BRICS, completely antagonistic towards China, an increasingly fascist ethno-state with massive, ties to Israel and its defense industry. It's always maintained strategic and autonomy. That's what they called it, between the U.S. and the USSR and China during the Cold War, where they'd buy Russian arms and exports, but also develop a free market economy with the West. It's full of its own contradictions, but so they're not really. What their defense focus is on this quote unquote axis. So from a fifth generation warfare perspective, where warfare exists mostly within like economic and cyberspaces and digital warfare, like information operations and misinformation, you can make an easy argument that we already are in World War III, and it might be a Cold War for some people, but it's definitely not a Cold War for people in Iran, Ukraine, Russia, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, Palestine. And let's not even get into Africa right now, because there's a lot of stuff happening with AFRICOM as well, and the buildup of arms around Taiwan. So I guess that's where we're gonna end, and I'm gonna look at some questions real quick. But this was an expansive topic. I just wanted to highlight the absurdity of the U.S. position, and you guys remember that they were supposed to refocus on the American continent. Like one of Trump's big campaign promises was, we're going to restore the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. The Monroe Doctrine being after the War of 1812, where the British reinvaded the United States. President Monroe basically signaled to all the European powers, the French, the Spanish, that the United States had complete dominion over the Western Hemisphere, and that any interference in that would be seen as an act of war. So we thought we were going to see a re-engagement and focus solely on the Western Hemisphere in a drawing down of global entanglements. But you only believe that if you can't do it, any sort of material analysis of our overriding economic system, which other commentators who may have been right about the war in Ukraine were wrong about, thinking that Donald Trump, an imperial president, would be any different. No, they're all from the same class. They support each other. That's why there are no Epstein files, because both Democrats, Republicans, Fortune 500 people, and oligarchs may or may not be on them. And you know what? They are really good, these guys, at expressing class solidarity better than any, because they know what's good for them. And so this is good for them. So let's look at some stuff. Jadzia says, someone told me they trying to make a billionaires party, and I'm like, don't they have both the Dems and the Republicans already? Damn, that's a zinger. Well, actually, no, because they've got the corporatists as well. The Democrats are more like the Fortune 500 white collar people that only have like 300 million in recognizable assets. Pretty much poors, pretty much working class individuals. They're still like generally mostly like East Coast liberal elites, but when push comes to shove, they all know what side the bread is buttered on. But so they do have culture war issues and stuff, but they still want no capital gains tax, foreign wars, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that I do think that a lot of the professional managerial class doesn't like is a lot of this chaos run by the Trump administration. because they like these long-term trade deals that take a long time to see a return on investment, and like infrastructure projects that chaos isn't good for. So there's always like factions and infighting within the upper echelons, but at the end of the day, they sit on the same boards and they know what's good for each other. So they're going to eventually toe the line when it comes down to it. Even if they don't like Trump, they find him odious and they hate how he does business, they will toe the line in order to maintain access to their privilege, wealth, and access to political power. So, yeah, there are differences, but nope, they all protect their own interests. And at the end of the day, they will express class solidarity. So, yes, U.S. uniparty, they don't live under democracy. They live under capitalism. It's not a monolith. There are factions, but again, they know where their bread is buttered. The billionaires want nothing but civil war, and I'm sure the Americans will comply. Yeah. I mean, I'm cool with the civil war as long as it's like class wars. Be like ICE and the rest of us. ICE, the billionaires, the corporatists, and like everybody else. Worse things could happen. So, casualties say, I think Gaza proved liberals will sacrifice the liberty of others for their own safety, whereas leftists will sacrifice. Yeah, we're about to find out, aren't we? I think the most frustrating thing about the Epstein files is that all of a sudden Democrats care about it. It's just like when Trump bombed Iran, they didn't care that he bombed Iran because they're ideologues too and political reactionaries too. They just said like, you need to go through the Senate. You need to go through the proper channels first. It's like if this was Star Wars, it'd be like Emperor Palpatine. You can absolutely build a genocidal death machine and call it the Death Star, but make sure you consult the Senate first. Yeah, that's why they always side with the fascists, the liberals, because in the end, they exist under the current economic system and political system. They benefit from it materially, and they will sacrifice their quote unquote principles, which they don't have any, but they will do whatever they need to do in order to maintain their privilege, wealth, and access to political power. So, okay. Scott Ritter got on GG yesterday, endorsement of it. Ugh. Oh, Scott Ritter was on George Galloway. George doesn't really challenge anybody. I've been on his show like 3 times, and I've had some hot takes. He actually challenged me when I said that Trump was a war candidate. And I was like, okay, well, we'll see. And now we see. Okay. It's also because George can't do any sort of, or doesn't want to do any sort of analysis of the overriding system, even though I do like a lot of his takes. But yeah. The West lost all legitimacy in the last decade or two. Too many Hillarys laughing madly. I assume that's a reference to Gaddafi. Excellent. Agreed. So, class war has to be global. This is why we have to stand in like transnational solidarity with all these things. Like you can't just be a one issue person. Like, that's what was so frustrating when Harris was on the campaign trail. Like everyone who was talking about Gaza, they didn't want to hear it, and they're like, I can't afford to be a single issue voter." I was like, motherfucker. I don't know if I could say it. Oh, whoops, beep. I was like, listen, person, intelligent, gentle person. This is a single issue. It's always been a single issue. It is a single issue. I know you might have to expand your knowledge base and stuff, but this is all a single issue vote. There's no distance between the war state, the police state, the carceral state, the national security state, and any iniquities we do overseas always rebounds back onto us. So, someone said, Calling Larry says, I'm one issue, Gaza. Well, yeah, I mean, Gaza is the greatest expression of our imperial power and what we're willing to do for it. Because again, whatever we are willing to do to Palestinians, we are inevitably willing to do to American citizens. Richard Blumenthal. Oh, he's stolen valor? Huh. I'll have to look into that. Richard Blumenthal was one of the co-sponsors of the tax Russia 500%. So, yeah. Anyways, guys, I think we're at the end of the time. I just wanted to get into this. I can't believe this is still a discussion. They're going to double down on everything they said. It's not going to work. But again, I really want to drive this home that the purpose of imperial war at this phase of the United States empire is not necessarily to win the war. So here we go. What to watch going forward? Trump said he would be imposing very severe tariffs if there's no deal with Russia in about 50 days. Okay, he'll back down. And I think I just wanted to address this story because it's really going to be a non-story. It's not going to change the facts on the ground. All it does is solidify that Trump has gone back on every single one of his campaign promises, just like every president does, because they all have the same masters and they support the same system. So that is a breaking news story, but the negotiations are over. I'm not sure the Iran negotiations are going to restart anytime soon. And if they do restart anytime soon, Iran will engage in them in good faith just because they want to demonstrate to the world that they are a rational actor who won't go back on their word, even though the U.S. has used and uses diplomacy continually as a form of misdirection and a political assassination. Just like the Russians, I'm not sure they don't seem to be willing to entertain anything less than their original ceasefire demands, which I enumerated. The biggest part of that is Ukraine not joining NATO and them not giving any sort of territorial concessions. And there's nothing we can do to leverage them into a different negotiating positions. And sending more air defense artillery systems ain't going to cut it. So sorry we didn't get to go to Lebanon. I don't like to plug my own stuff on this, but we will be doing a episode on Ukraine and Lebanon and what shenanigans the U.S., the Gulf states, and Turkey are playing there tomorrow on my own personal platform at Colonial Outcast. So, guys, thanks so much for listening. This has been Negotiations Are Over. The mask is now off. There's no reason to pretend like they're anything else. You know, they're protecting their own interests and they're going to keep fighting the wars and saying that the Epstein files don't exist because this is where we're at on the receding hairline of the U.S. empire. Yeah, free Palestine and screw ICE. And we will see you Thursday because we're now doing State of Play twice a week. So something crazy will happen, and I'll see you next Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks, y'all, for watching, and have a good Monday night. It's going to be a hell of a week. Cheers, y'all.